In 1909, a sealed room on the outskirts of Pompeii was opened for the first time in nearly 2 millennia. On the walls, archaeologists did not find ruins. They found 55 feet of a continuous, deeply unsettling painting. Life-sized figures, bathed in a dark red pigment, immortalized in the middle of an unexplained ritual. The experts photographed the site, cataloged the discovery, and closed the door. 115 years have passed. Theories were built, and academic congresses debated every single detail. Even so, to this day, no researcher has been able to explain what was truly happening in that room. The chamber survived intact under the volcanic ash for 2,000 years, but its true purpose remains an absolute deafening silence. Just 1,300 feet from the main walls of the ancient city stood an estate that seemed to ignore the commercial hustle of Pompeii. Known today as the Villa of the Mysteries, this site was no simple country home. It was a massive architectural complex. It was meticulously designed for luxury, and above all, for total isolation. A labyrinth of corridors surrounded by sweeping private gardens, exclusive bathing areas, and a colossal wine cellar. A cellar built to store thousands of gallons of wine on an almost industrial scale. Whoever this family was, they held a quiet and considerable power. The true name of this dynasty has never been confirmed by researchers, but they operated right on the bleeding edge between the prestige of the high elite and the physical limits of the city. They were buying the exact privacy needed to conduct practices their neighbors were never meant to see. In the fall of the year 79 AD, the daily rhythm of that house came to a grinding halt. The collapse of Mount Vesuvius offered no time for an organized escape and no room for goodbyes. The mansion was mercilessly swallowed by a pitch-black storm of dense ash and heavy layers of pumice stone. The sheer weight of the volcanic debris sealed the roofs, blocked the doors, and choked the breath out of anyone who failed to outrun that thermal darkness. From that exact second, time stopped flowing in those halls. The estate remained buried. It went untouched by sunlight and unseen by human eyes for exactly 1,830 years. It became a vacuum of pure silence, trapped deep beneath the Italian soil. When the heavy tools of the excavation teams finally broke ground in the year 1909, the workers immediately knew this was no ordinary archaeological site. As the volcanic ash was carefully brushed away, an almost surreal state of preservation revealed itself. Complex mosaics still lay perfectly aligned on the floor. Vibrant colors still pulsed on untouched walls. Pieces of furniture, though charred by the extreme heat of the eruption, kept their exact shapes in the very spots where they were abandoned at the final hour. Walking down those excavated hallways felt like trespassing. It felt like invading the intimate lives of people who had just turned the corner. But the real shock was waiting at the end of one specific hallway. Archaeologists mapped out a distinct room, strategically positioned to shield anyone inside from the outside world. When the glow of the lanterns lit up that space after 19 centuries, the impact was undeniable. The walls held the densest, most continuous, and most inexplicable paintings ever discovered in the entire Roman Empire. Before we cross this threshold to investigate exactly what these figures are hiding, be sure to leave a like and comment down below telling us where you are watching from. We love getting to know our viewers, and we make it a point to reply to everyone. Now give me your absolute focus, because what lies inside that room defies everything science knows about the ancient world. The silence inside that room is almost physical. It is thick, heavy, and loaded with a tension that time itself could not wash away. When the original door was pried open, the first thing that hit the excavators was not the painted human forms. It was the magnetic, intimidating sheer force of the color. The three main walls of the room are entirely armored in a deep, almost hypnotic pigment. It is a brilliant scarlet, a unique Pompeian red, born from that specific volcanic region. It was crafted through a chemical process so raw yet so refined that applying it on this massive scale would have cost an absolute fortune. This impenetrable backdrop is not just a decorative choice. It acts as an isolated stage for a dark theater that was never meant to have an audience. Across 55 unbroken feet, 29 strictly life-sized figures haunt the room. The realism baked into every brushstroke is deeply uncomfortable. There are no relaxed faces here. There are no welcoming smiles or friendly greetings. Every single character carries a severe, dead serious expression locked onto a hidden goal, and they are not painted as separate portraits in invisible frames. This is a single narrative. It is a continuous chain of events that bends around the masonry corners, forcing you to physically turn your body in the center of the room just to follow the exact order of the action. The scene has a logical starting point on the left side of the main entrance. It builds into a dense core that dominates the back wall and fades into a quiet aftermath on the right. The most brilliant and unsettling detail is the sightline of the painted figures. They do not just look straight ahead, they stare at each other across the geometric corners of the room. They interact through the empty air, weaving an invisible web of sharp glances right over the heads of anyone standing inside. Right at the start of the rite, the heavy weight of formality is laid bare. A woman, tightly wrapped in a dark ceremonial veil, listens with razor-sharp attention. A smaller figure, likely a servant or a low-ranking initiate, reads the words from an unrolled scroll. The body language screams that ironclad rules are being laid down, or perhaps it is the reading of a point of no return vow of silence. From the moment that decree is spoken into the air, the mood of the painting plunges into the shadows. Everyday life steps aside for the unknown. Women prepare cryptic offerings with cold, mechanical movements. Handmaids pour dark liquids into consecration bowls. And then, without any warning, the wall of reality shatters. Inhuman entities bearing massive dark wings stand tall, sharing the exact same breathing space as mortal human beings. In the exact epicenter of the room, lounging in a posture of absolute control and deep lethargy, sits the central figure of worship, the ultimate god of excess, of the vines, and of rule-breaking. He watches a ritual unfold that undeniably belongs to his realm of power. But what makes archaeologists hold their breath even today is what happens in the immediate sequence, right next to this spiritual leader. One of the painted women is bent over, forced to her knees. Her face is buried and hidden in the lap of another woman who is desperately trying to shield her with her hands. Right behind the kneeling figure, a winged entity raises its arm with violent precision. It grips an instrument, pulling back to deliver a ruthless, ritualistic whipping across the woman's bare back. The posture of the woman taking the punishment carries an unexplainable mix of willing submission and agonizing pain, endured in total silence. Meanwhile, the figures standing just inches away keep dancing in a trance-like state. They are completely oblivious or entirely numb to the brutal punishment happening right beside them. It is the raw, unfiltered depiction of a devotion that demanded severe physical trials. This right here is the beating heart of modern investigative frustration. This private room, buried deep in the guts of the mansion, was never built as an art studio to entertain wealthy guests. That monumental fresco was planned, funded, and painted for a strictly practical purpose. It worked as a life-sized manual of conduct. The select few who had the privilege or the sheer nerve to lock that door from the inside knew exactly what every piercing look, every raised whip, and every spilled cup truly meant. This was walled off, highly protected, lifelong knowledge. It was designed to make sense only inside the minds of those who had already crossed the threshold into the cult. When the mountain ripped open and blacked out the sky in the 1st century, it did not just wipe out the architecture of the estate. In a matter of hours, it exterminated every single human being capable of reading that living code. The master key to unlock the true intentions behind those walls turned to ash, right alongside the owners of the house. We have the complete document, forever burned into the plaster. But the psychological dictionary needed to read it was wiped off the face of the earth. Ever since the volcanic ash was scraped off that floor in the year 1909, modern archaeology has desperately tried to shove this painting into some known drawer of Roman history. For over a century, scholars from countless universities have obsessed over every square inch of that plaster. They published massive dissertations, they hosted global conferences, and they tried to decode the panel to the point of exhaustion. The result of all that heavy lifting is a quiet, agonizing academic frustration. Not a single theory can explain the room from start to finish. Every time a hypothesis seems to crack one part of the sequence, it completely falls apart the second it hits the next painted figure. The most popular explanation, the one that usually dominates the textbooks, claims the room was an initiation space for the cult of Dionysus. At first glance, this makes a lot of practical sense. The lounging central figure is the god of wine himself, and the surrounding estate literally operated as a massive commercial-scale wine factory. The story on the walls would show the steps a young woman had to endure to join this secret society, but there is a massive structural flaw that experts often sweep under the rug. When historians stack the painting up against actual written records of Dionysian rites, the pieces simply do not fit. There is not a single ancient scroll or surviving text that talks about a ritual where dark-winged demons physically interact with worshippers, nor is there any record of this exact kind of violent trial. Deep down, the initiation theory is just an attempt to put a neat label on something archaeological science does not actually understand. Trying to steer away from the occult, a second camp of archaeologists pushed for a strictly domestic view. They argued that those 55 feet of art actually show behind-the-scenes preparations for a high society bride. The woman hidden under the dark veil would be listening to the formal reading of a marriage contract. The other figures would simply be setting up ritual purification baths. It is a clean, very safe, and comfortable theory, but it completely crumbles the moment you look at the right side of the room. No elite, wildly wealthy family would ever commission a massive piece of art for their home that features a woman on her knees, burying her face in someone's lap, while being whipped by a supernatural monster. The sight of a woman being brutally beaten on that wall shatters the idea of a happy, festive wedding event. The ceremonial suffering painted there has absolutely zero parallels in Roman marriage art. A third line of investigation tried to argue the room was just a tribute to the dramatic arts. The people on the wall were supposedly acting out a famous theater play of the time. However, the armored layout of the complex instantly kills that idea. That room is extremely restricted. It was built with isolation in mind. It was designed to hide a very small number of people in total secrecy, not to act as a brightly lit stage for an eager audience. On top of that, the figures are not wearing the heavy, highly stylized theatrical masks that were strictly required for acting during that era. This brings us straight to the ultimate breaking point of the whole structure, the massive roadblock that science simply cannot get past. The woman taking the physical beating. In standard classical Roman art, brutal punishments were reserved for mythological tales, usually against mortals who dared to challenge the gods. Roman art did not capture real, high society women taking part in events where they willingly submitted to this level of violence. The raw realism of the pain and the tense body language of the woman trying to comfort her totally break away from any catalog standard. That whipping is not a visual metaphor. It is a raw, bloody depiction of a real-world trial demanded by a closed-off group. The chilling truth is that the exact reason why anyone would volunteer for this and what they gained in return vanished from history beneath the burning rocks of the volcano. To truly understand what went down in the dark of that room, we have to pull our eyes away from the walls and look at the colossal structure surrounding it. The Villa of the Mysteries was not just an isolated luxury retreat. At its core, it was an agricultural powerhouse. Archaeologists mapped out massive facilities completely dedicated to pressing and storing grapes. The estate pumped out wine on an incredible commercial scale. It was more than enough to supply the local elite and rake in an unimaginable fortune for the owners. In the ancient world, wine was never just something you drank at dinner. It was the physical, liquid manifestation of the god dominating that painted room. The drink acted as the vehicle mortals used to try and touch the realm of Dionysus. The family running this empire was directly tied to the figure worshipped on that fresco. But if this god was so common in Roman culture, why on earth did the ritual need to be strictly locked away in a secret armored room, completely hidden from the public eye? The answer is buried deep in the political archives of Rome, dating back almost 3 centuries before the eruption. In the year 186 BC, the Roman Senate went into high alert. The leaders of the empire realized that Dionysian cults were quietly spreading through their cities like wildfire. To the government, this was not just an alternative religion. It was a direct, dangerous threat to the structural order of society. These rites pulled in people from every single social class, melting down Rome's rigid hierarchies during nights of intense devotion. Behind those closed doors, the laws of the state completely ceased to exist. Rome's reaction was ruthless and heavily documented. The Senate dropped a brutal decree outlawing the cult's practices across the entire Roman territory. Sanctuaries were smashed to pieces by force, leaders were suffocated, and thousands of followers met a tragic, bloody end at the hands of merciless authorities. The empire tried to wipe this loyalty off the map with sheer military force. But history proves time and time again that absolute bans rarely kill off a deeply rooted belief. They only force the devotion to adapt to the dark. The cult did not die out. It simply left the well-lit streets and retreated deep into private estates, operating way off the government's radar. And this exact timeline is what makes the villa's location such a gold mine for archaeology. The estate was strategically built just outside the city walls of Pompeii. It sat in the perfect geographic sweet spot, far away from urban patrols and the prying eyes of the magistrates. That locked room was not just some eccentric flex by a millionaire family. It was a literal architectural vault. It provided the ultimate safe haven, allowing the followers of a hunted faith to keep running their rituals entirely underground. They were shielded by a wall of massive wealth and the safety of distance. This elevates the weight of the 1909 discovery to a totally different level. Those 55 feet of painted plaster are not just high-end decorative art. They are a living documentary of ongoing resistance and extreme, life-threatening danger. This family bankrolled the visual proof of a highly illegal practice. If the Roman authorities ever found out what was happening inside that isolated room, the fallout would have been apocalyptic. The owners would have lost their lands, their fortunes, and their heads. The agonizing irony that haunts investigators to this day is the cruel twist of time. The catastrophic volcanic eruption that wiped Pompeii off the map in a matter of hours ended up acting as an unbeatable, bulletproof shield for the room. By burying the house under crushing layers of rock and ash, Vesuvius saved the painting from human destruction. Against all odds, thanks to the sheer fury of nature, those walls now hold the only authentic visual record of an underground ritual that the Roman Empire tried with everything it had to erase from the memory of mankind. The monumental painting is just the top layer of this massive historical puzzle. For the archaeologists mapping the Villa of the Mysteries, the initial shock of staring at those walls quickly turned into a grueling, meticulous crawl across the floor. And what the team started pulling out from under the hardened ash proved once and for all that this closed room was not just an art gallery. It was an active, highly specific space, constantly in use. Scattered across the floor and the immediate entryways, researchers cataloged several physical artifacts that ground the painting in cold, hard reality. These were small ceremonial objects, pieces forged for tasks that standard archaeology simply could not fit into the daily routine of an elite Roman household. Among these bizarre finds, one specific item immediately caught the experts' eyes. It was a female figure cast in bronze. Her facial features and posture did not match a single classic deity from the Roman pantheon. She had been left right there, forgotten in the dark, seemingly standing guard over the entrance to the sacred room. But the most hard-hitting, emotionally heavy discovery was not made of metal or clay. To really grasp the psychological gravity of this place, we only need to walk a few feet away, right into the quarters next to the Great Red Room. As the 1909 excavation team pushed through the side halls, digging out the crushing layers of pumice stone that flooded the house in the fatal year of 79 AD, they hit bone. They found the remains of a woman. Later, forensic analysis proved she was roughly 50 years old at the exact moment Mount Vesuvius swallowed the region whole. Finding bodies near Pompeii is not rare. Thousands of people failed to outrun the wrath of the mountain. But what makes this specific woman an absolute chilling mystery for science is her physical posture and the exact context of how she met her inevitable end. During the terrifying hours of Pompeii's collapse, blind panic wrote the rules of survival. The records of almost every single victim show people sprinting for the city gates. They show massive, chaotic crowds on the beaches, people cowering under reinforced staircases or desperately trying to cover their faces against the toxic gas and the rain of burning rock. The chaos was absolute, and human despair was brutally frozen into the earth. But this woman, sheltered deep inside the Villa of the Mysteries, showed zero signs of running. There were no marks of sudden panic, no signs of a frantic, last-minute struggle to live. She was not sprinting toward the exits of the massive complex. She was not clawing at the rocks and ash, barricading the doors when the thermal storm and total darkness permanently swallowed the estate. She simply sat down, and she waited in absolute silence. Her isolation was not some tragic accident. It was a crystal-clear, conscious choice made in the final seconds of her life, and the artifacts prove without a shadow of a doubt that she was no forgotten servant, left behind in the chaotic escape. The diggers found her body surrounded by refined jewelry and items of immense financial value. She carried the unmistakable wealth of the elite. She was someone who had the money, the power, and the logistical resources to jump into a fast carriage hours earlier, the second the ground started shaking. But she deliberately chose not to cross the walls of her estate. Her physical, intentional closeness to the painted room raises the most uncomfortable questions that the history of archaeology simply cannot answer with facts. Who was this woman, sitting in the pitch black, while the world outside literally burned to the ground? Was she the great matriarch of the family, the owner of the ungodly fortune that paid for that secret room? Or was she the highest-ranking authority of the cult itself, the high priestess pulling the strings of the ritual. There is a line of thought that humanizes this tragedy in a totally devastating way. She knew the cult was ruthlessly hunted by Rome. She knew the room was physical proof of high treason against the empire. Perhaps when she realized the catastrophe would do a flawless job of burying the secret forever, she made one final call. She accepted the end with pure stoicism. She became the final, solitary guardian of the mystery. The volcano sealed her fate, and it kept the room pristine. But in doing so, it completely erased the only human witness who could have told us what actually happened inside those blood-red walls. The fate of that woman sitting in the dark directly echoes the fate of the mystery she might have been trying to protect. When the structural collapse and the heavy ash finally silenced the residential complex, in the year 79 AD, the unpredictable force of nature acted as an unforgiving vault. By wiping out all human presence around it, the volcano ensured that those 55 feet of painting survived practically untouched, trapped in an isolated underground vacuum. But the real historical tragedy kicked off the exact second that door was forced open again in 1909. Exposing the room to the air of the modern world triggered a quiet, highly corrosive countdown. The definitive answer to what happened in that room is slowly fading away right in front of the eyes of science. And the archaeological community knows they are losing a do-or-die race against the clock. The cold, uncomfortable reality is that the ancient fresco is dying. For exactly 1,830 years, that sealed underground chamber kept the temperature and the humidity perfectly stable. It shielded the pigment from lethal oxidation and from the burning heat of the sun. But the moment fresh winds blew into the room at the dawn of the 20th century, the iconic Pompeian red, that thick scarlet hugging every human figure on the wall, began to react violently. Oxygen became an instant enemy. On top of the unavoidable environmental shock, the panel took a massive beating from the limits of preservation science at the time. The early crews working the site were deeply dedicated, but they used conservation methods that today are considered wildly aggressive. In the early decades of public tours, restorers slathered layers of artificial waxes and heavy chemical solvents directly onto the original plaster. It was an act of desperation. They wanted to make the colors pop and protect the fragile wall from atmospheric dust. But the long-term blowback from these chemical treatments was the exact opposite of what they wanted. The old waxes sank deep into the pores of the paint. As the seasons rolled by, they began to darken and crystallize. This created a harsh, cloudy film that choked the light out of the artwork and warped the genuine faces of the figures. The chemical makeup of the pigment suffered permanent, irreversible damage. Tiny cracks and unavoidable flaking are currently taking crucial pieces of history down with them. With every passing decade exposed to the Italian weather, the monumental image loses a little more of its original, striking sharpness. The modern urgency to crack this code grows by the day, simply because we have absolutely zero other written records to fall back on. The Roman Empire was a hyper-bureaucratic machine, obsessed with logging every state law and decree. But the Dionysian cult ran entirely in the opposite direction. If there ever were sacred scrolls or physical notes breaking down the complex initiations of that room, they met a fast end. They were instantly incinerated by the brutal heat of the ash, or they rotted away into dust under the damp, silent earth. Not a single scrap of text survived to point investigators in the right direction. The doctrine of this group was strictly word of mouth. It was passed down in the whispers of midnight rituals. To guarantee the state could never seize hard proof of their crimes, we were left with nothing but a life-sized visual document. A document whose very ink is now dissolving right under our watch. The members of the underground cult the only people who held the exact key to decode the weight of that whip, and the numb posture of the submissive woman hit their absolute limit on that exact fall afternoon when the sky caved in. The answer to the mystery always relied on the direct link between the living memory of the followers and the immortalized art on the wall. Nature wiped out the guardians of that human memory in one single strike. And now, the centuries are collecting their toll on the paint. It is a deeply profound and totally heartbreaking historical realization. The Red Room might never be completely understood because the investigative puzzle keeps losing essential pieces every single year. What our generation fails to read on those walls today will very likely never be read by anyone, ever again. In the fall of the year 79, the mountain played no favorites. The collapse of Vesuvius choked out the loud, bustling markets with the exact same mechanical coldness it used to erase the exclusive halls of the Roman elite. The thermal storm buried the architectural complex of the Villa of the Mysteries without an ounce of mercy. But by sealing that specific room under feet of heavy volcanic debris, nature ended up forging the ultimate vault. For the 1830 years that followed, the walls, bathed in that hypnotic Pompeian red, slept in an absolute vacuum of sound and time. They stayed immune to the grinding winds. They stayed safe from the imperial wars that completely redrew the map of Europe. They were shielded from the sun, and most importantly, they were safe from the destructive hands of humanity. The riddle slept in the deepest dark. It was guarded only by the crushing weight of the earth, and by the lonely presence of a woman who, for reasons we may never fully grasp, decided to wait for the end in total, unbroken silence. When the digging shovels finally broke through the ceiling in 1909, the light of the modern world crashed into the room. The explorers of that era honestly believed they had just cracked the untouchable, intimate core of the empire. The path was cleared, and soon that ancient floor was swarming with cameras, academic catalogs, and chemical testing gear. The modern world has thrown its entire scientific arsenal at those walls over the last 11 decades. 115 years have burned away in exhausting analysis and endless debate. Researchers have poured their entire careers into staring at every severe face, every submissive pose, and every single movement of the 29 figures locked in the plaster. And after all that time and all that massive effort, the final verdict of archaeology is a heavy, frustrated silence. Not a single theory ties the whole scene together. No consensus can logically explain why a high society family would ever commission a piece of art showing brutal physical torture and non-human demons sharing the floor with mortals. Modern science has proven to be incredibly good at sweeping away the ash, cataloging the jars in the wine cellar, and carbon dating the bones left in the hallway. But we have completely and totally failed to translate the minds of the people who actually lived in that space. Those life-sized figures remain stranded inside a psychological universe that we are strictly locked out of. They are carrying out an impenetrable code of conduct, rules that turn to dust the very same afternoon the sky crashed down on Italy. The masonry door was unlocked, but the secret of the room never made it out. The master key to decoding the ritual lived and died in the living memory, and the hushed whispers of the underground cult, and the sheer force of nature snuffed them all out in one brutal swing. We were left with nothing but a jaw-dropping visual shell. We are forced to stand back and watch as the original paints react to the oxygen, fading a little more every passing year, constantly reminding us of our own ticking clock. This reality forces a hard look at how we deal with the unknown. We tend to hold on to this comforting arrogance that history is just a massive filing cabinet, always waiting for us to open it. We believe that if we just dig a little deeper or build a better piece of tech, The ancient world will eventually surrender all its answers. But the Villa of the Mysteries silently proves the exact opposite. There are ancient alliances, deeply secret rituals, and human choices that were brilliantly designed to leave zero trace. The woman sitting in the dark and the cold stares frozen on those walls stand as the ultimate warning. They remind us that the past will always hold the undeniable right to keep some of its doors permanently locked. If the depth of this investigation changed the way you look at the events of the ancient world, make sure to drop a like and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss our upcoming historical documentaries. Use the comment section to share your own theory about who that woman left behind really was. We make it a point to read and reply to the people who follow our work closely. Keep questioning the easy answers, because the past is infinitely darker and more complex than the official records claim. We will see you in the next investigation.